Welcome back to Payback Logs. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. The mind is a delicate machine, but it's also remarkably loud if you know how to listen to the gears. In my 40 years as a neuropsychologist, I've sat across from thousands of patients. I've watched the precise moment a synapse misfires, the subtle hesitation in a word recall test, the way a hand trembles when asked to draw a clock face. I know the smell of a brain in decline, a cocktail of cortisol, missed medications, and the quiet, crushing weight of fear. But this morning, as I stood in the doorway of my own study, the only thing I smelled was expensive, cloying perfume. It was midnight jasmine, the scent my daughter-in-law Vanessa uses to announce her presence before she actually says a word. Vanessa was sitting in my leather swivel chair, the chair Clara bought me when I was appointed to the State Board of Medical Examiners. She was organizing. That's the word she used when I cleared my throat. She didn't jump. Vanessa is far too practiced for that. She simply looked up, smoothed her perfectly tailored skirt, and gave me a look of practiced, pitying warmth. "Elias," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescending sweetness one usually reserves for a toddler or a golden retriever. "I didn't hear you come in. I was just helping you clear out some of these old files. It's so easy for things to get cluttered at your age. We don't want you getting overwhelmed, do we?" I am 72 years old. My resting heart rate is 62 beats per minute. My blood pressure is 115/75. Every morning I complete the New York Times crossword in ink, and I do it in under 12 minutes. Clutter is not a word that exists in my vocabulary. "Elias," I said, my voice level and dry, "those old files are the longitudinal datasets for the state's competency standards, the ones I wrote in 1998 and revised in 2014. They aren't clutter, they are legal benchmarks." She laughed, a short, sharp sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, listen to you. Always the doctor. But honey, I found 3 utility bills in the desk drawer that were marked overdue. And look at your keys." She pointed to the antique silver tray on the sideboard. My keys were sitting there, but they weren't where I usually put them. I am a creature of habit. I placed them on the left side of the tray, parallel to the edge. These were tossed in the center, tangled with a set of spare house keys I haven't used in years. I didn't leave them like that. Vanessa sighed, a long, dramatic exhale. She stood up and walked toward me, placing a hand on my forearm. Her grip was just a little too tight. "Elias, that's what I mean. You think you didn't, but you did. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to let us take the wheel for a while. Mark and I just want you to enjoy your golden years without the stress of managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio. It's a lot of math, Elias, a lot of heavy lifting for the mind." I looked down at her hand on my arm. To a casual observer, this was a scene of a caring family member supporting an aging patriarch. To a trained neuropsychologist, it was the first stage of a clinical erosion strategy. "I'm quite capable of doing the math, Vanessa," I said, gently but firmly, removing her hand. "The portfolio is currently diversified across 82% low-risk indices and 18% high-yield medical tech. Its valuation as of the closing bell yesterday was $8.42 million. I assure you, the math is the simplest part of my day." Her smile faltered for a microsecond, a leakage in the facial muscles that suggested frustration. "Of course, dear, but maybe we should have someone look at those bills, just to be sure. I actually ran into a friend of mine, Dr. Sterling. He's a geriatric transition specialist, very modern. He said he'd love to drop by for tea sometime, just a friendly chat." "A geriatric transition specialist," I repeated. I knew the term. It was the polished corporate euphemism for a cleaner, a doctor who specializes in finding enough cognitive impairment to justify a fast-track conservatorship. "I think I'll pass on the tea," I said. "Well, think about it," she said, picking up her designer handbag. "I'll leave you to your benchmarks. Oh, and Elias, I took the liberty of throwing out the trash in your office. It was overflowing." She glided out of the room, the scent of midnight jasmine lingering like a stain. I waited until I heard her SUV pull out of the driveway. Then I walked over to the wastepaper basket near my desk. It wasn't empty. She had emptied it into the larger bin in the kitchen, but she had missed a small slip of paper that had fallen behind the liner. I picked it up. It was a business card. Dr. Elias Sterling, Geriatric Transition and Estate Competency. On the back, in Vanessa's sharp, aggressive handwriting, were 3 words that sent a cold, familiar ripple through my nervous system. Final evaluation, Friday. I sat down in my chair. I didn't feel panicked. I felt observant. I looked at my keys on the tray. I knew I hadn't moved them. I knew I hadn't missed those utility bills. I have an automated payment system for every recurring expense in my life. An overdue notice was a physical impossibility unless someone had manually intercepted the digital confirmation and replaced it with a forgery. Vanessa was smart, but she was making a fundamental error. She was trying to gaslight a man who spent his entire professional life studying the mechanics of the lie. She was attempting to use a clinical path to seize control of my estate, and she was bringing a hired gun to do the dirty work. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one with the hidden latch. Inside was a leather-bound journal. It was my private log, a habit from my days in the lab. Subject: Vanessa Thorne / Dr. Elias Sterling. Phase: initial observation, attempted environmental manipulation. Keys: forged billing. Hypothesis: attempted hostile takeover of financial assets via manufactured incompetency filing. I looked at the clock on my wall. It's a precision German regulator. The second hand swept forward with a silent, relentless grace. Vanessa thought she was setting a trap for a frail old man. She thought the $8 million Clara and I had built was an easy target, a prize for the person who could shout dementia the loudest. She forgot that I didn't just study the standards for competency. I am the reason those standards exist. I didn't just write the book. I built the courtroom where the book is read. I picked up my pen. My hand was perfectly steady. The first crack had appeared, but it wasn't in my mind. It was in her plan. And through that crack, I was going to watch her entire world dismantle itself. Welcome to the lab, Vanessa. Let's see how you handle the stress test. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. The following week was a masterclass in psychological attrition. Vanessa didn't just walk into my house, she began to haunt it. If the mind is a machine, Vanessa was trying to throw sand into the gears, one grain at a time. It started with the micro-sabotage. I woke up Tuesday morning and reached for my glasses on the nightstand. They weren't there. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, and my study. I eventually found them tucked inside the refrigerator, sitting behind a carton of oat milk. A casual observer would call it a senior moment. Vanessa, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, didn't say a word. She just gave me a long, lingering look, the kind of look you give a dying fire. On Wednesday, the speed dial on my phone was altered. My son Mark's number, usually 1, had been swapped with the front desk of a local hospice care center. When I tried to call him to discuss a dividend reinvestment, a somber voice answered, "Graceful passages, how can we help your transition today?" I hung up. I didn't get angry. Anger increases heart rate and clouds executive function. Instead, I sat at my desk and opened my hidden journal. Wednesday, 10:14 a.m. Manipulation of telephonic shortcuts, placement of corrective eyewear in thermally inappropriate locations. Vanessa is escalating from micro-sabotage to active disorientation. The family intervention happened on Thursday evening. I was reading a medical journal in the living room when the front door opened. Vanessa walked in, followed by Mark, who looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours, and a man I didn't recognize. The stranger was in his late 30s, wearing a suit that cost more than his medical expertise was likely to be worth. He had a groomed beard and a smile that felt like it had been sprayed on. "Elias," Vanessa said, her voice hushed as if she were in a library. "We needed to have a little talk. Mark is very worried. We all are." Mark wouldn't look me in the eye. He's a good man, but he's soft, the kind of man who believes that if his wife is crying, she must be right. "Dad," he stammered, "Vanessa told me about the bills and the glasses. She said you were confused about where you were this morning." "I was in the kitchen, Mark. I was looking for my glasses because someone put them in the refrigerator." Vanessa gasped, covering her mouth. She looked at Sterling. "See, Aris, the paranoia. He thinks someone is planting things. He's externalizing his memory lapses as a conspiracy." The stranger stepped forward, extending a hand. "Elias, Dr. Sterling, Aris Sterling. Vanessa mentioned you've been feeling a bit foggy. It's perfectly natural. The brain is a muscle. It tires out. I thought we might just run through a few simple exercises, just to put Mark's mind at ease." I looked at Sterling. I knew his type. He was a compliance doctor. He didn't look for the truth. He looked for the diagnosis that the person paying his invoice wanted to hear. "You want to perform a bedside cognitive screening," I said. It wasn't a question. "Just a few basics," Sterling said, pulling a laminated sheet from his briefcase. "The MMSE, Mini Mental State Examination. Standard stuff." Standard stuff. I was the one who helped calibrate the scoring metrics for the MMSE in this state 20 years ago. I knew every question, every trap, and every normative response for a man of my education level. "Please," I said, gesturing to the armchair opposite me, "proceed." Vanessa and Mark sat on the sofa like a jury. I kept my face neutral, the judge's mindset. "Elias," Sterling began, leaning in, "can you tell me what year it is?" 2026. "And the season?" "Spring, specifically the Monday after the spring equinox." Sterling nodded, marking a sheet. "Good. Now I'm going to name 3 objects. I want you to remember them and repeat them back to me in a few minutes. Apple, table, penny. Apple, table, penny." I repeated. I didn't just memorize them, I visualized them as markers of his incompetence. He moved through the test, serial 7s, spelling world backwards, naming common objects. I answered every question with a calculated 3-second delay. Too fast, and I looked offensive. Too slow, and I looked impaired. I hit the optimal average. Then came the clock-drawing task. "Elias, I'd like you to draw a clock face on this paper, put in all the numbers, and set the time to 10 minutes past 11. This is the gold standard for executive function. It tests spatial organization, planning, and abstract thinking." I picked up the pen. I could have drawn a perfect anatomically correct circle, but I didn't. I drew a slightly shaky circle. I placed the numbers correctly, but I made the 11 just a hair larger than the rest. I saw Sterling's eyes flicker. He saw a deficit. He saw a reason to keep the investigation going. He saw dollar signs. "And those 3 words from earlier?" "Apple," I said. I paused, looking confused. I let my gaze wander to the ceiling. "Table, and I believe the 3rd was a nickel." "Penny," Sterling corrected gently, his smile widening. "It's okay, Elias. Close enough." Vanessa let out a small, jagged sob. "Oh, Mark, you see, he can't even remember the penny." Sterling stood up and tucked the sheet away. "Well, Mark, Vanessa, there are some notable irregularities, nothing definitive yet, but certainly enough to warrant a deep dive assessment. I'd recommend a formal competency review by the end of the week. We want to protect Elias's interests before any significant financial decisions are made." "Thank you, Doctor," Vanessa whispered. They left together, leaving me in the living room with the fog of their concern. Mark stayed behind for a moment, looking at me with a mixture of love and pity. "It's for the best, Dad. We just want you safe." He patted my hand and walked out. I waited until the front door clicked shut. Then I stood up and walked to the sideboard. I picked up the pen Sterling had left behind. I sat down, and on the back of his own business card, I drew a perfect anatomically correct diagram of the human brain, labeling every lobe, every fissure, and the specific neural pathway responsible for deception. Vanessa thought she was gaslighting me. She thought she had led a lamb to the slaughter. She didn't realize that in my world, a failed test isn't a sign of weakness, it's a data point. She wanted a formal hearing. She wanted the deep dive. I opened my journal and wrote one final line for the night. "Antagonist has accepted the bait of a false positive cognitive decline. Subjective bias confirmed. Initiating the counter-audit." I wasn't the one losing my mind. I was the one mapping the trap. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely.
The silence of the house tonight feels clinical, like the sterilized air of a research lab. Without the noise of Vanessa's concern, the memories of Clara begin to settle into the empty spaces. People see the $8 million figure, and they see a pile of gold. They don't see the 40 years of late-night double-blind studies, the smell of formaldehyde, and the relentless discipline it took to build a life from nothing. Clara was the brilliant one. If I am the map-maker of the mind, she was the explorer. We met in a basement lab at Johns Hopkins in 1978. She was wearing a lab coat that was 2 sizes too big, meticulously calibrating an electron microscope. While our peers were out celebrating the end of midterms, we were arguing over the ethical implications of neurotransmitter manipulation. "Elias," she had said, not looking up from the lens, "the brain is the only thing in the universe that tries to understand itself. If we're going to study it, we have to be more honest than the organ we're examining." That honesty became our foundation. We didn't spend our money on Ferraris or summer homes in the Hamptons. We lived in a modest faculty apartment for a decade, funneling every spare cent into a diversified portfolio of medical patents and early-stage biotech. We were betting on the future of our own field. When the patents for the Thorne synapse inhibitor were bought out by a global pharmaceutical firm in the late 90s, the $8 million didn't feel like a windfall. It felt like a receipt for a lifetime of work. But then came the irony that still bites. Clara, the woman who knew every fold and fissure of the human brain, was betrayed by her own. It started with a subtle aphasia, a struggle to find the word for spoon or telephone. Most people would have ignored it, but we knew. We sat in my study, the very room where Vanessa now plays her games, and we ran the tests on each other. I held her hand as I watched her fail the same word recall exercises I had just faked for Dr. Sterling. The glioblastoma was aggressive. For 18 months, I became her primary caregiver. I wasn't just her husband, I was her clinician. I tracked her decline with a technical precision that kept the grief at bay, at least during the daylight hours. I learned then that the most devastating thing about losing your mind isn't the forgetting, it's the moments of clarity where you realize exactly what you've lost. 3 weeks before she died, She pulled me close. Her voice was a raspy shadow of itself. "Elias," she whispered, "our legacy, it isn't the money, it's the standards we set. Don't let them turn our work into a circus. Don't let anyone who didn't see the struggle tell the story of the end." I made that promise into her hair, smelling the faint scent of the medicinal shampoo she hated. Now, 30 years later, I sit in the dark and look at the midnight jasmine Vanessa left behind. Vanessa, who married Mark because she saw a growth asset rather than a husband. Vanessa, who views my $8 million as a lifestyle upgrade she's owed for the inconvenience of being related to me. She sees a frail widower. She doesn't see the man who watched the strongest mind he ever knew crumble and didn't flinch. She doesn't realize that my stoic nature isn't a symptom of aging, it's a hardened shell forged in the fire of Clara's final months. I walked over to the closet in the hallway and pulled out Clara's old winter coat. It's a heavy navy blue wool. I don't keep it for sentimental reasons. I keep it because it's a physical reminder of the weight of responsibility. I reached into the pocket and felt the small laminated card I had placed there years ago. It was a copy of the Thorne Competency Metric, the actual legislative document I drafted for the state. Section 4B. Capacity is not the absence of error, but the presence of a consistent, logical framework for decision-making. Vanessa and Dr. Sterling are looking for errors. They are looking for the apple, table, penny I let them think I forgot. They aren't looking for the framework. I sat back down at my desk. I pulled out a 1982 Casio, the calculator Clara used for our first patent filing. I began to run the numbers on Vanessa's lifestyle. I know what her car payments are. I know what the tuition at the private academy for my grandson costs. I know exactly how much burn rate she has before she hits a zero balance. She is desperate. And in my experience, a desperate mind is a predictable mind. I looked at the picture of Clara on my desk. She was smiling, her eyes bright with the thrill of a new discovery. "They're trying to turn it into a circus," I whispered to Clara, "but they forgot who owns the tent." The ghost of the past isn't a haunting, it's a hauntingly accurate set of instructions. Stage 3 was about remembering why I'm fighting. Stage 4 would be about identifying the vulnerabilities in the enemy's front line. I picked up the phone. It was time to call in a few favors from the old guard. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely.
The mind of a narcissist like Vanessa is surprisingly easy to map once you understand their primary drive, the avoidance of perceived status loss. To a clinical eye, her care was nothing more than a desperate attempt to shore up a crumbling facade. She wasn't interested in my health, she was interested in my liquidity. While she spent her afternoons moving my car keys and whispering to Mark about nursing home brochures, I spent mine doing what I spent 40 years doing, peer reviewing a fraud. I started with Dr. Eris Sterling. A quick search of the State Medical Board's disciplinary database revealed a private history that Vanessa clearly hadn't vetted. Sterling had been sanctioned twice in the last decade, once for overprescribing sedatives in a geriatric setting and once for conflict of interest regarding an estate settlement in Boca Raton. He wasn't a doctor, he was a vulture with a stethoscope. But a quiet audit requires more than just Google. I reached out to Arthur, an old friend and a retired forensic accountant who specialized in high-net-worth divorces. We met at a nondescript diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee is strong enough to keep you awake for a 3-day deposition. "Elias," Arthur said, sliding a manila folder across the sticky laminate table, "your daughter-in-law is a walking debt-to-income disaster. She's leveraged the equity in her and Mark's house to the hilt. She's got 3 luxury credit cards at their limit, and she's 6 months behind on the country club dues she insists on paying. I opened the folder. The numbers were staggering. Vanessa was carrying nearly $400,000 in unsecured consumer debt. The lifestyle she projected on social media was a house of cards held together by payday loans and interest-only refinances. "And the boy?" I asked. "My grandson, Leo." Arthur sighed. "That's the part that bites, Elias. She withdrew him from his specialized tutoring for his dyslexia 3 months ago, claimed he outgrew it. In reality, the school was going to put a lien on their bank account for unpaid tuition." I felt a cold, familiar tightening in my chest. It wasn't the paranoia Vanessa diagnosed me with, it was the biological response to a threat against the pack. Vanessa was willing to stunt Leo's development to maintain the illusion of wealth. She needed my $8 million, not just to survive, but to erase the evidence of her own incompetence. I spent the next 48 hours setting up the technical infrastructure of my defense. If I were truly failing, I wouldn't be able to manage a complex digital surveillance suite. I installed 4 covert, motion-activated cameras in the common areas of my home, disguised as smoke detectors and Wi-Fi extenders. I didn't want to catch her stealing silver, I wanted to catch the gaslighting. On Friday afternoon, the final evaluation was scheduled to begin. I sat in my study and watched the live feed on my monitor as Vanessa entered the house with Sterling. She didn't know I was watching. She walked over to my desk and, with a practiced, casual flick of her wrist, knocked a stack of carefully organized medical journals onto the floor. "Oh, Elias," she said to the empty room, her voice rehearsed, "you really must be careful. You're becoming so clumsy." Then she took my daily pill organizer, the one I had filled that morning, and emptied the Wednesday and Thursday slots into her palm, dropping the pills into her purse. She was manufacturing the medical evidence of my forgetfulness. I recorded every second of it. I time-stamped the metadata and uploaded the encrypted files to 3 separate cloud servers with a dead man's switch trigger that would send the links to the district attorney and the state medical board if I were ever forcibly removed from the premises. Then I went downstairs to meet them. I wore an old, slightly mismatched cardigan, a visual cue for Sterling to latch onto. I let my posture slump just enough to imply a loss of core stability. "Elias," Sterling said, his smile as sharp as a scalpel, "ready for our deep dive? We're going to do some neuroimaging and a comprehensive battery of cognitive assessments. It's for your own protection, of course." "Of course," I said, my voice thin. "Whatever Vanessa thinks is best. She's very thorough." Vanessa beamed, her hand resting on my shoulder in a way that felt like a predator pinning its prey. "We just want the truth to come out, Elias, that's all." "The truth is a very stable structure, Vanessa. It's the lies that require constant maintenance." She blinked, the first flicker of genuine confusion crossing her face. She didn't recognize the quote. It was from the preface of my 1998 textbook, The Architecture of Competency. Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out a digital tablet. "Let's begin with a spatial orientation task, Elias. Can you tell me exactly where we are and what day it is?" I gave him the correct wrong answer. I gave him the answer a man in the early stages of hippocampal atrophy would give, one that was almost right but just confused enough to justify further intervention. It's Friday," I said, looking toward the window, "and we're at the faculty club, aren't we? Or is it the library?" Vanessa's hand tightened on my shoulder. I could almost feel her pulse racing. She thought she had me. She thought the $8 million was finally within reach. I knew their debts, I knew their frauds, and I had them on high-definition video. Now it was time to move to where the secondary victim would be revealed, and my professional detachment would finally burn away.
The professional detachment I've cultivated over 4 decades is a cold, hard shell. It's what allowed me to tell families their loved ones wouldn't recover. It's what allowed me to watch Clara slip away without losing my own mind. But even the strongest shell has a failure point, and Vanessa found mine. It wasn't the theft of my money or the gaslighting of my senses. It was Leo. Leo is 10 years old. He has his grandmother's inquisitive brow and a way of tilting his head when he's trying to solve a puzzle. He also has a moderate form of developmental dyslexia, a glitch in the phonological processing center of the brain. It's not an intellectual deficit, it's a technical hurdle. With the right intervention, he'd be a scientist. Without it, he'd spend his life feeling broken. I was sitting in the kitchen on a Saturday morning nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee when Mark dropped him off for grandpa time. Mark looked like a man who was drowning in shallow water. "Vanessa has a gala committee meeting," Mark said, avoiding my eyes. "Can you watch him for a few hours? He's got homework." "Of course," I said. I sat with Leo at the heavy oak table. He opened his backpack, and I saw the frustration instantly. It was a simple reading comprehension assignment, but the words were dancing on the page for him. He was guessing, his eyes darting frantically, his breathing shallow, signs of a nervous system under acute stress. "Let's use the color overlays, Leo," I said softly, "the blue ones we got from the specialist." Leo looked down at his lap, his voice a mere whisper. "Mom took them. She said they were crutches. She said I have to learn to be normal because we can't afford to be special anymore." The air in the kitchen suddenly felt very thin. I am a neuropsychologist. I know exactly what happens to a child's self-esteem and neural plasticity when early intervention is stripped away in favor of tough love born from a parent's financial greed. "She took the overlays?" I asked, keeping my voice a neutral, clinical flat. "And the tutor," Leo added, a single tear tracking through the dust on his cheek. "Mrs. Gable hasn't come in a month. Mom told her I was cured, but I'm not, Grandpa. I'm getting stupider." I felt a surge of adrenaline so potent that it made my vision pulse. Vanessa wasn't just looting my estate, she was cannibalizing her own child's future to pay for the midnight jasmine and the gala committee fees. She was neglecting a documented medical need to preserve her lifestyle. In the eyes of the law, that's not just bad parenting, it's the exploitation of a dependent. "You aren't getting stupider, Leo," I said, placing my hand over his. "The brain is just a series of roads. Some are blocked, so we build new ones. That's all. We're going to build a highway today." I went to my study and pulled a spare set of high-contrast overlays from my medical kit. As we worked, I watched him. I saw the way he squinted, the way his hand cramped. I began to mentally draft a pediatric neurodevelopmental assessment. I wasn't just his grandfather anymore. I was a board-certified expert witness, documenting a case of medical neglect. While Leo worked, I used my phone to check the hidden camera feeds from the day before. I saw Vanessa in the living room talking on the phone with Dr. Sterling. "I don't care about the boy's tutor, Aris," she hissed into the receiver. "I need the competency hearing moved up. My credit line is frozen. If I don't get control of Elias's accounts by the 15th, I'm done. Just write the report. Say his executive function is at a third-grade level. Who's going to challenge you?" "Elias is a big name, Vanessa," Sterling's voice crackled through the speaker. "I need more incidents documented, physical ones." Vanessa looked around the room. Her eyes landed on a heavy crystal vase Clara had bought in Prague. She walked over to it and nudged it to the very edge of the mantelpiece. "Considered it done," she said. She walked away, leaving the vase teetering.
hoping I'd walk by, catch it with my sleeve, and prove my lack of motor control and spatial awareness. Or better yet, she was waiting to find it shattered and claim I'd thrown it in a fit of senile rage. I looked at Leo, who was finally reading a full sentence without stuttering, thanks to the blue overlay. The professional detachment was gone. The judge's mindset had shifted into something far more dangerous, the executioner's precision. Vanessa thought she was playing a game of chess with a crumbling old man. She didn't realize she was playing with a man who had spent his life studying how to dismantle the very psyche she was using to attack him. She had hurt Leo. She called my grandson's struggle a crutch. I walked over to the mantelpiece. I didn't move the vase back. I took a small piece of transparent fishing line from my tackle box in the garage and secured the vase to a hidden hook behind the clock. It was still on the edge. It looked like it would fall, but it wouldn't move an inch. Vanessa wanted a physical incident. I was going to give her a technical impossibility. I went back to the table and smiled at Leo. "You're doing great, Peanut. One more paragraph and then we'll call the district attorney. We'll get some ice cream." Leo laughed. He didn't know the difference, but the audit was no longer quiet. It was stage 5, and the secondary victim had just provided the final piece of evidence I needed to bury Vanessa and her transition specialist for good. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. Thank you, for real.
The preparation for a reckoning is a silent affair. In my years of clinical practice, I've seen that the most effective traps aren't built of steel and wire, but of an opponent's own overconfidence. Vanessa was so certain of her victory that she had stopped looking at me as a person and started looking at me as a pre-authorized withdrawal. I spent Sunday night in the basement, where my old private servers are kept. I wasn't just checking bank balances, I was drafting the dead man's switch. This is a technical term for an automated information release. I compiled every recording of her gaslighting, the financial audit showing her mountain of debt, the footage of her tampering with my medication, and, most importantly, the clinical evaluation I had performed on Leo. I bundled these into a secure, encrypted file. I programmed the server. If my unique biometric login wasn't entered every 24 hours, this file would be automatically dispatched to the state medical board, the district attorney's elder abuse division, and the school board where Vanessa sat as a pillar of the community. But that was just the insurance. The trap itself was the golden standard self-evaluation. I sat before a high-definition camera in my study. I wore my suit, my glasses, and a look of absolute, terrifying clarity. For 2 hours, I performed a self-competency defense. I ran through the most advanced cognitive batteries in existence, the ones I had helped design. I recited the state standards for competency verbatim. I explained with clinical precision exactly how Vanessa and Dr. Sterling were attempting to manipulate the Thorne metric to bypass the law. "I am Dr. Elias Thorne," I said to the lens, my voice steady. "Today is Sunday, March 22nd, 2026. My cognitive load is optimal. My executive function is in the 99th percentile for my age group. What you are about to witness in the upcoming hearing is not a man in decline, but a controlled experiment in the identification of predatory fraud." Then I called my attorney, Sarah Jenkins. She's an old guard litigator who specializes in high-stakes estate defense. She doesn't use disruptive jargon. She uses the law like a blunt instrument. "Elias," she said, her voice crackling with amusement after I laid out the plan, "you want to let them go to the hearing? You want to let them file the incompetency motion?
I want them to commit to the lie, Sarah. I want them to sign their names to the diagnostic report in front of a judge. If we stop them now, they'll just retreat and try a different angle. I need them in a courtroom where the testimony is under oath and the penalties for perjury are federal. And the $8 million? It's bait, Sarah. It always has been. On Monday morning, Vanessa discovered the crystal vase was still on the mantel. She had bumped into it 3 times, expecting it to shatter. Each time, the invisible fishing line held it fast. I watched her on the camera feed, her face contorted with a mixture of confusion and genuine terror. She was starting to doubt her own reality. The gaslighter was being gaslit by the house itself. "Elias," she shouted from the hallway, her voice high and strained, "the hearing is tomorrow morning, Elias, 9 a.m., Judge Miller's chambers. He's an old friend of ours. He just wants to make sure you're being looked after." "An old friend of ours," I repeated, nodding slowly. "How convenient. I look forward to meeting him." I went back into my study and closed the door. The invisible trap was now a physical reality. I had allowed her to think she had the judge in her pocket. I had allowed her to think I was clumsy and confused. I even allowed her to see a fake bank statement I'd left on the printer, showing a sudden, inexplicable loss of $2 million in a failed crypto investment. She had practically run to the phone to tell Sterling. They were going to argue that my reckless spending was the final proof of my dementia. They were going to walk into that courtroom expecting a funeral for my autonomy. They didn't realize that I designed the room, wrote the rules, and was currently holding the gavel. I checked my Casio. 10 p.m. I visited Clara's picture one last time before bed. "The circus is coming to town tomorrow, Clara," I whispered, "and I've made sure the lions are hungry."
The courthouse was a monument to institutional gravity. Granite pillars, mahogany paneling, and the hushed rhythmic scuff of expensive shoes on marble. Judge Miller's chambers were smaller, more intimate, designed for the sensitive discussions of families falling apart. Vanessa was already there, seated next to Mark. She was wearing a somber navy suit, her hair pulled back in a tight, severe bun. She looked like a grieving widow, despite the fact that I was sitting 10 feet away from her, very much alive. Dr. Eris Sterling sat to her right, his briefcase open, a stack of folders, my life's supposed decline, neatly arranged. "Elias," Judge Miller began, looking at me over his spectacles with a mix of practiced sympathy and boredom. "This is an informal competency hearing. The motion filed by your daughter-in-law, supported by Dr. Sterling's preliminary findings, suggests that your executive function has reached a point where you are a danger to your own estate. We are here to determine if a temporary conservatorship is necessary." Sarah Jenkins, my attorney, leaned back. "We understand the gravity, Your Honor. Please let the petitioner present their evidence." Vanessa stood up. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floor, her voice trembling with a practiced cinematic fragility. "It's been heartbreaking, Your Honor. Elias was a giant in his field, but lately he's forgotten utility bills, he's hid his own glasses in the freezer, he's become paranoid, accusing me of planting things, and most recently, he's made series of erratic multi-million-dollar investments in cryptocurrency that have vanished. We just want to protect what's left for his grandson." "Dr. Sterling?" the judge prompted. Sterling stood, adjusting his tie. "I've performed a battery of tests, Your Honor. The results are consistent with early-onset hippocampal atrophy and significant deficits in executive planning. His clock-drawing task showed clear spatial neglect. His word recall was abysmal. He couldn't remember a simple penny after 3 minutes. Based on the state competency standards, Elias Thorne no longer possesses the capacity to manage a portfolio of this complexity." "The state competency standards?" I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was low, rasping slightly, playing the part. The Thorn metric? Yes, Elias, the very standards you helped draft. It is a tragic irony, really. It is, I agreed. I stood up, slowly, leaning on my cane. Your Honor, may I approach the bench? I've brought a few technical clarifications. Vanessa smirked. She thought I was going to plead. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of high-definition, color-printed stills from my hidden cameras. I laid them on the judge's desk. This, I said, pointing to the first image, is Vanessa Thorne at 2:14 p.m. last Thursday, removing my prescribed medications from my daily organizer and placing them in her handbag. This is her manually moving my glasses into the refrigerator while I was in the garden. And this, I said, sliding a final photo across the wood, is Vanessa nudging a crystal vase to the edge of a mantelpiece to manufacture a supposed physical incident of my supposed clumsiness. The room went deathly silent. Vanessa's fragile expression shattered. She looked at the photos, her mouth hanging open. Your Honor, interjected Sterling, this is irrelevant. Surveillance of a family member is a sign of the very paranoia I'm not finished, heiress, I said. The old man rasp was gone. My voice was the cold, resonant baritone of a chief of staff. Sarah, please play the audio from yesterday morning. Sarah pressed a button on her tablet. The room was filled with the sound of Vanessa's voice, sharp and predatory. I need the competency hearing moved up. Say his executive function is at a third-grade level. Who's going to challenge you? Judge Miller looked at Sterling, his brow furrowing. Dr. Sterling, did you have a financial arrangement with the petitioner outside of your standard consulting fee? No, We've already subpoenaed your offshore accounts in Boca Raton, heiress, Sarah said calmly, and the $50,000 consultancy payment that hit your account from Vanessa's frozen credit line this morning. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, Dr. Sterling cited the Thorn metric. As the primary author of that legislation, I'd like to point out that Section 7.A requires a gold standard peer review in cases of disputed professional standing. I performed that review on myself, recorded under clinical conditions 48 hours ago. I handed the judge a tablet. In this video, I perform a full neurological self-exam. I also discuss the technical flaws in Dr. Sterling's previous screening. For instance, heiress, you failed to account for the fact that a penny is a low salience distractor for a man of my socioeconomic bracket. Had you used pension or portfolio, the recall would have been instantaneous. You chose a test designed for failure, not for diagnosis. I leaned in, my hands flat on the judge's desk. But more importantly, I said, I have filed a concurrent report for medical neglect against Vanessa Thorne. She stripped my grandson, Leo, of his documented dyslexia treatments to fund this very litigation. She used a 10-year-old boy's neurological health as a bargaining chip for my $8 million. Mark, who had been sitting in shocked silence, suddenly stood up. He looked at the photos of Vanessa stealing my pills. He looked at the bank records. Then he looked at his wife. You took Leo's tutor money? You told me he was cured. Mark, honey, I did it for us, Vanessa wailed, her mask completely gone now. The hearing is over, Judge Miller said, his voice echoing with a cold judicial fury. Dr. Sterling, stay where you are. Bailiff, please escort Dr. Sterling and Mrs. Thorne to the holding area. I am referring this matter to the district attorney for elder abuse, fraud, and perjury. And Sarah? Yes, Your Honor. I need the state medical board to get a copy of that Boca Raton file by noon.
Vanessa began to scream as the bailiff took her arm, a high, jagged sound of a predator who had finally realized she was in the cage. She looked at me, her eyes full of a pure, concentrated hate. I didn't look away. I watched her the way I'd watch a biological specimen under glass. "Elias," she shrieked as they led her out. "You're a monster. You've always been a monster." "No, Vanessa," I said softly as they led her out. "I'm just a neuropsychologist. I simply diagnosed the problem and applied the appropriate treatment." The room cleared out. Mark sat back down, his head in his hands, sobbing quietly. I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. It was the first time I'd touched him in months without it being a test. "I'm sorry, Mark," I said, "but the legacy is safe, and so is Leo." I walked out of the chambers, my Oxfords clicking on the marble. The grand reckoning was over. The technical standards had held. The $8 million was exactly where it belonged. But as I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, I realized that the most important competency wasn't something you could measure with a test. It was the ability to protect the people you love from the people who only love what they have. The audit was closed.
The courthouse steps were bathed in a harsh, unforgiving light that seemed to bleach the color out of the city. I stood there for a moment, adjusting my glasses and feeling the weight of the leather briefcase in my hand. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't smell like midnight jasmine. It smelled like ozone, rain, and the sterile exhaust of the city. It smelled like reality. The aftermath of a psychological dismantling is never clean. Vanessa was facing a litany of charges: third-degree elder abuse, felony fraud, and perjury. Dr. Sterling's medical license was suspended pending a full board review, and his Boca Raton assets were frozen by a court order. Mark had filed for divorce 48 hours after the hearing. He was a broken man, but for the first time in his adult life, his eyes were clear. I returned to the farmhouse. The house was exactly as I had left it, yet it felt different. The fog Vanessa had tried to manufacture had lifted. I walked to the mantelpiece and snipped the invisible fishing line holding Clara's crystal vase. I moved it back to its rightful center, its facets catching the late afternoon sun and throwing rainbows against the mahogany walls. The silence was no longer a weapon, it was a sanctuary. A week later, I invited Leo over. We didn't do homework. We didn't do cognitive drills. I had hired Mrs. Gable, his old tutor, to come to the house twice a week, paid for by a dedicated educational trust that Vanessa could never touch. But that afternoon, we just sat in the garden. "Grandpa," Leo asked, poking at a beetle with a stick, "are you really the boss of the brain?" I laughed, a real, deep-chested sound that felt foreign to my ribs. "No, Peanut, nobody is the boss of the brain. It's too wild for that. I'm just a guy who knows how the wiring works." "Mom says you're scary now." "Precision can be scary to people who live in the dark, Leo, but it's the only way to find the light." I watched him run across the lawn, his movements fluid and unburdened. The secondary victim had been restored. The technical hurdles were still there, but now he had the equipment to jump over them. That evening, I went to the cemetery. I don't go often. I don't believe Clara is under that granite slab. She's in the patents, the standards, and the way Leo tilts his head. But I needed the ritual. I sat on the small stone bench and looked at her name. "The circus is gone, Clara. The lions were fed, and the tent is secure." I felt a quiet peace settle over me, a clinical homeostasis. I had kept my promise. The legacy wasn't just $8 million, it was the refusal to let a predator define the truth. I returned home and went to my study. I sat in my leather chair, the one Clara bought me, and opened the final page of my private journal.
I didn't use the judge's mindset this time. I used the auditor's finality. Final clinical note, case 2026 legacy. Patient, the Thorne Estate/the Family Unit. Observation, acute parasitic infection, Vanessa Thorne/Aris Sterling, successfully identified and excised via legal and clinical intervention. Prognosis, excellent. Financial assets, $8.42 million, secured in a multi-generational irrevocable trust. 529 college savings restored. Patient status, stable. The subject, Elias Thorne, demonstrates 100% cognitive agency. Final disposition. The audit is closed. No further follow-up required. Signed, Elias Thorne, Ph.D., ABPP. I closed the journal and placed it in the back of the safe. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. It was empty. There were no SUVs, no transition specialists, and no lies. I checked my Casio, 7 p.m. I walked to the kitchen, made a pot of tea, and sat at the table. I didn't reach for a crossword puzzle. I didn't check the closing bell. I just sat there, listening to the rhythmic, steady ticking of the house. The mind is a delicate machine, and tonight every gear was turning exactly as it should. I'm 72 years old. I have $8 million, and for the first time in 14 months, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Thank you for listening to Payback Logs. If you enjoyed this journey of neurological justice, don't forget to hit that like button, leave a comment about your favorite part of the reckoning, and subscribe to the channel. It's what keeps these logs coming. We'll see you in the next one.